Our keynote speaker is Janet Metcalfe, and you will have all seen the biography in the attached material. She's chair and head of VITE, and their mission is to lead world-class career and professional development of researchers. I think you'll all agree she's really well qualified to give our keynote address entitled Career Challenges Facing Researchers. Dr. Janet Metcalfe.
So the title of the forum is If Research is So Good, Why Do We Make It So Hard for Researchers? And when I was thinking about what I was going to talk about, it was like we make it hard in so many ways. It's like maybe we should be looking at in what ways do we make it easier for researchers, because that would maybe fit within a meaning. But I do hope that the presentation I'll give you will give you some food for thought. I'm going just a little bit about VITE if you're not familiar with us. We were launched in 2008, but we've been working in this area since 1960. Okay, sorry. We've been working in this area since 1968, doing professional development for doctoral researchers. But in 2008, we extended our remit to include what we call research staff. So anybody that's employed primarily to do research in universities, research institutes. And it would probably include clinicians who are trying to sustain some research activity alongside their normal roles. And we work at all levels, informing policy, working directly with institutions, working directly with researchers, and also research into the issues that are facing the research sector in terms of supporting the career development. So we'll look at the impact of what we're doing and whether or not any of this is making a difference. And we'll also look into researcher careers because it's been a very underexplored area in terms of what are the researcher career paths and how well can we support them. So I'm going to talk about a few things. First of all, looking at the research environment and the challenges that are facing us in terms of what that research environment will look like in the future. A little bit about the aspirations of researchers in terms of their careers. Sorry, I'm not doing my... I look at the HR Excellence Award, which is a European initiative, which I think is a very useful vehicle to look at some of the issues that we're looking at this morning. And then finally, a project that we're doing about what happens to research staff if they don't get academic positions. Where do they go? And how do they feel about having to have moved out of research? And then I'll leave you with one slide about giving you some suggestions about the ways in which you can improve research, the research environment. So I started by looking at Ireland's policy in terms of investment in research. And these were the things that I pulled out of the document Agenda 2020 in terms of why the government is funding research. So if I'd stood here maybe 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, it would have been about pushing forward the frontiers of knowledge. That doesn't even make the list anymore. The emphasis is very much on the application of research. The top one being, research is going to be the savior of this country. I've not been to a country where that isn't up, first of all, that all our economic growth is going to come through research, innovation, and highly skilled researchers. So that's the first burden we're putting on our researchers, that actually the economy is dependent on them. Helping the economy use that research, we're all struggling to ensure that you can get the absorptive capacity in terms of industry and other sectors to be able to absorb and use research effectively. Developing the country's international reputation, attracting and retraining the right people, and I know that's a very big topic in Ireland in terms of trying to attract both investment and highly skilled people into Ireland. Education and training in the population, evidence-based policy making, and I suppose also for you, in terms of the medical health research, is about evidence-based practice as well, in terms of how do we ensure that our practice is based on good science. And then finally, enriching culture and civilization. And if that's not enough in terms of what we're asking our researchers to do, we're also asking them to save the world by dealing with all of the grand challenges as well. So this message sort of weighs quite heavily on most researchers' shoulders. I can see them when I talk to them directly. They're sort of, oh my God, can't I just get on with my research? Can't I just do things that I want to do? And then if you look at the way the research environment is changing as well, first of all, I've got the 3 I's, which have come from the European research area. Much more emphasis on interdisciplinary research and multidisciplinary research teams, the need for international experience, the need to have, I've called it intersectoral readiness, which is about understanding the requirements of different sectors, of being able to move between different sectors. So we've been dealing with that up until 2 or 3 years ago, when the Commission have started talking now about the 3 O's, in terms of the way the research environment is changing, and that's the importance of open access and publication, the importance of having open data, and there's certainly been a big topic about the reproducibility of research, particularly in the health sciences, and open science and innovation, which for me is probably the most scary one, because what does that mean in a practical sense? How do we ensure that science is open? And at what stage do you make it open so that everybody can participate in it? All of these have interesting challenges in terms of research integrity. And I think that's an area where it's very important that we start thinking about much more fundamentally, how do we ensure that we maintain or improve our research integrity in this sort of environment when things are going to be much more open? There's much more emphasis in terms of involving research users, engaging the public in research, and for the health sciences, that patient advocacy as well. Hugely challenging in terms of how do you make that work well. And then finally, evidencing the impact. Certainly a massive topic in the UK with our research excellence framework in terms of requiring researchers to be able to show that public money was well spent and that you can see positive impact and benefits from it. So one of the reasons why we got involved in this area, and particularly I want to talk about the development of our research development framework, because we were very conscious this environment is changing so much that we need to support researchers in helping them to think what competencies, attributes, and skills successful researchers need. It's no longer good enough to be an excellent researcher. You have to have a whole bundle of competencies that allow you to work within this changing environment. And we developed the researcher development framework because we wanted researchers to be recognized as professionals. We wanted them to be seen as valued members of our community. And I think we're making some progress there. But we've still got a long way to go before people see this as a good profession. I mean, some people say a state agency is a profession. So why are we not talking about researchers as professionals? We wanted to have something that allowed individual researchers to reflect on their strengths and their weaknesses as a researcher and enable them to develop themselves to their maximum potential. We wanted something that looked forward so that it would look, say, 10 years from now in terms of what is it, how do you need to develop for the future, and help them assess their particular strengths and to benchmark themselves in terms of how successful as they are as a researcher. And then finally, we wanted to develop a common language so researchers can articulate their competencies. So researchers find it very easy to talk about their research. they found it much less able to talk about what their competencies are and what they can contribute to an organisation, which makes that intersectoral mobility much harder for them in terms of being able to sell themselves to potential employers or even talk to people, to non-researchers in a language that's accessible for them. So my third slide in terms of what's so hard is around the research environment as well. We've got increasing number of doctoral graduates coming through. I know Ireland has been trying to double or treble their doctoral graduates. I haven't been to a country or an institution that hasn't got a target for growth in doctoral numbers. So we are increasingly investing in high-level skills, and I think that's fantastic. I think everybody should have an opportunity to do research if that's what they want to do. But it does mean that we do have to think about our responsibility in terms of how do we support them. Because we've got increasing numbers of research staff, postdoctoral researchers, who are effectively caught in a trap in this system. From the briefing paper, it's quite clear that there are particular issues in Ireland in terms of supporting research staff. And the increase in numbers coming into the system is not helped by a very static environment at the other end of the chain in terms of that career structure. We can all imagine that there's not going to be any change in terms of the growth of the academic community. Certainly all over Europe, we're not going to see a huge increase in terms of the number of academic positions. So it's not going to improve. It's certainly going to get more competitive for these researchers. So I think that puts more obligation on how we support them through those early stages of their research. We're seeing increased global activity in terms of research, much more competition coming from India, Asia, South America, which means that the attractiveness of Europe in terms of a place for companies to invest in research is being challenged as well, because we're very high cost base, and therefore we're always at risk of losing some of our research investment in terms of going to Asia or India or even South America. So Europe has a particular issue, but how do we stay competitive within such a high cost base? But one of the good pieces of news is because of this increase, if you look on a global level, there are no shortage of academic positions. Overall, there is a demand for academics, but you have to prepare to be very mobile. If you want to go and work in Africa or South America or Asia, there are plenty of academic opportunities. And maybe that's one of the things that we need to talk to about our researchers about how do we encourage them to be even more adventurous and mobile in terms of their aspirations. And then finally, we are creating and exacerbating the problems ourselves, because the perception is, and I hear it all the time, that the first choice is an academic career. We've recently been doing some research on unconscious bias, and it's quite interesting how often, if you're reinforcing that message every day, how hard it is to step away from that. So you hear people talking about researchers lost to science. You hear, and I've seen it in the papers here, about the leaky pipeline, with the implication that that's negative. You hear people talking about a plan B, plan A always being an academic career. So the research we have done in terms of career aspirations, we can see that when PhDs start their PhD in their first year, they have fairly low levels of aspirations for an academic career. In the UK, it's about 35%. We can see year on year as they go through their PhD program that those aspirations increase. So they're at about 65% by the time they finish their PhD. Now, some of that may be they fell in love with research, and that's the only thing they want to do. But I'm sure a vast majority of it is that constant reinforcement that academic is the first and the best choice, and everything else is a failure. So we have to think about our own language. We have to think about how do we make it acceptable for researchers to consider other opportunities. By the time we get to the research staff, their career aspirations, 80% of them are looking for an academic position. These are the results of a survey we do called CROSS, the Careers Research. Sorry, it was a late night last night. The Careers Research Online Survey, right, Careers and Research Online Survey. 80% of them are aspiring to an academic career. 60% are expecting to achieve it. Now, nobody has accurate figures about what the likelihood of that happening, but everybody talks about 10%. So how do we get over this mismatch between 60% of the research staff population expecting to get an academic career and only 10% doing it? And I think that's one of our challenges in terms of how do we move forward on this. And I think the HR Excellence Award is a really useful way of thinking about it. It's based on the European Charter and Code. I don't know how familiar most of you are about this, so I'll just run through it a little bit. The European Charter and Code has 40 principles in terms of good practice in supporting researchers. It applies to all research organizations and it applies to funders. If you sign up to the Charter and Code, you can apply for an HR Excellence Award, which means you've made a commitment to improve the opportunities for researchers. The process is quite a simple process. You need to do what's called a gap analysis. So you need to look at the principles and say, how well are we doing against this? Which are the areas that we could improve on? You need to have an action plan saying, these are the actions that we're going to take over the next couple of years. And the nice thing about this award is that it's your actions. You need to commit to them personally. You don't have to do specific things. It's like, this is what I've committed to. And in order to apply for and get the award, I'm going to do those specific actions. It's acknowledged by the European Commission. And increasingly, we're seeing reference to it in European funding proposals as well, and within the terms and conditions required for proposals. 2 years, there's an internal review, so you need to sit down and review it at a strategic level. How are we doing against our action plan, and what are our actions for the next 2 years? And then at the 4-year stage, it's an external review where international peer reviewers will look at your action plan and come to your institution and say, yes, you are making progress in terms of your own actions. And then that cycle is repeated. In the UK, we have 94 universities that have taken the award. And I'm often asked, why have so many universities in the UK taken the award? And it's because we've made a deliberate decision to use it as a mechanism that values the UK. And doing that, instead of adopting the Charter and Code, we revitalised a concordat that we'd had since 1996, which has 7 principles in terms of the expectations and responsibilities of researchers, their managers, employers, i.e. institutions, and funders. They're inarguable principles. Nobody could stand up and say, I don't agree with that principle, because they're very basic and they're unobjectionable. We emphasize, probably more so than the Charter and Code, the responsibilities of researchers in this process. Because all too often, we feel that researchers are passive about their position. They're expecting things to change for them. And one of the things that we certainly want to do in the UK is to engage researchers in that change process. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. And then finally, we emphasize the importance of implementation and review. It's fine having a concordat, but unless you implement it and then follow through to make sure that those actions are happening, then we forget about it. So it's been very useful for us to have this 2-year process going on, because it means institutions are taking a step back and looking at things. When we consulted on the Concordat, we asked institutions what were their concerns around researchers' careers. And these were the things that institutions identified in terms of the challenges that facing them, about making a research career more attractive, about recognizing the researcher profession, providing career structures, improving the quality of training, the importance of professional developments and wider skills for researchers, and most importantly, the need for collective and collaborative approaches. And I think this is the key. I understand that in this audience, we've got representatives of everybody that needs to be at the table to take a collective approach to move this forward. And you do need everybody involved, and you all need to be heading in the same direction. I've included this quote from Lord Sainsbury, who looked at our last Concordat. We had an initiative around the last Concordat from 1996, and it was reviewed in 2003. And basically, the report said, for all the great work that's done, for all the initiatives, for all the way things have changed, very few individuals have noticed that difference on the ground, which is, I think, really sad, because that's a lot of effort gone into trying to change the system, but actually for the individuals, they've not noticed that much difference. So that's what we're trying to change. We're trying to change it so we know individual researchers are seeing the differences. And we do that by working at all levels and with all organisations in the UK. So we launched the Concordat in 2008 alongside VTI. So it's a very clear statement. The Concordat is signed by every major research funder in the UK. It's signed by all the institutions. And there are a range of supporters of the Concordat, which are all the professional bodies and other organisations that have an interest around researchers' careers. VTI basically is the conscience of the Concordat. We're the people that keep reminding the institutions and the funders that we made this commitment and that we want to move the whole thing forward. And two of our most important mechanisms are surveys that we do every 2 years of research staff, which is our cross-survey, and of principal investigators and research leaders, which is our Pearl survey. And we ask them very specific questions about their experiences and views in terms of how researchers are supported. We have another program which is called Every Researcher Counts, which is our equality and diversity agenda. And that's about how do you support individual researchers irrespective of any characteristics or personal circumstances that they may have, and recognizing that everybody needs a personal experience. And of course, we have the Researcher Development Framework, which is not only something that individual researchers use, but every institution in the UK uses that to reflect on the training programs and the support that they give researchers. They have mapped their training provision against the RDF to see where the gaps are and where their focus is in terms of their own particular strategies and needs. And it's being used at a policy level as well as a policy reference document. So all of the Research Council's funding calls for doctoral training and for fellowships require people putting proposals in to have considered how they're supporting the researchers against that framework of the Researcher Development Framework. We're using the HR Excellence Award basically as our 2-year review process. And as I said now, 94 universities have the award. And many have had the award for 4 years and are going into their 6-year process. We have the legacy of the Roberts funding, which was money that was given by the government back in 2004 that was specifically earmarked for the professional development of researchers. And that's been very important in this agenda because it sort of kick-started it. They weren't huge sums of money. It was based on the number of Research Council funded researchers, but it was earmarked and institutions had to report on how that money was spent on an annual basis. We have the Research Excellence Framework that, although it's focused on the impact of research, there is a section on there on the research environment. And we have ensured that the Concordat is in that. and individual units of assessment, so down at the discipline or research group level, they have to report on how they've supported the professional development of their doctoral researchers, research staff, and academic staff in terms of the Concordat principles. All of the funding terms and conditions reference how important professional development is, and the research councils expect to see evidence of that. And we have strong alignment with the Athena Swan Equality Charter, which has been, particularly in the health sciences, has been very influential in the UK, because our National Institute of Health announced overnight that an institution couldn't apply for any health funding unless they have Athena Swan Charter. So talk about creating a reaction in an organisation, in a sector. Almost overnight, 3 times as many universities applied for Athena Swan Award because they couldn't apply for health funding anymore. So there are instruments that can be used very effectively in terms of getting institutions to take notice of these issues. So in 2012, we surveyed institutions who'd engaged in the HR Excellence Award and said, why are you doing this? What are the benefits for you? And these are the messages that came out. And interestingly, the top 2 was contribution to strategic goals about improving the impact of research, and institutional strategies in terms of recruiting the best talent for research. Now, in 2008, we reviewed every single institutional mission statement and strategy to see how important researchers were in terms of institutional strategies. Not one mentioned researchers. Not a single one in the universities said our goal is to attract highly talented researchers or to support researcher careers. They all talked about research outputs and teaching. And some talked about third missions in terms of social responsibility, but nobody mentioned researchers. If you now look at the Russell Group strategy statements, they all mention researchers. And that's a really important message for us because it means the Pro Vice-Chancellor and the Chancellors have to report to their boards on their strategy statements. So that agenda has been embedded at a very high level within institutions, and we can use that leverage. And we can use the fact that if you are not following your HR Excellence Award plan, the award can be taken away from you. And there's nothing like a threat of removing a badge from a Vice-Chancellor's desk to get some action. And I shouldn't say this, but we have had to use that threat at a couple of our Russell Group institutions as well. And it's enormously effective. It takes days, if not a week, to get some action moving. So there's another interesting leverage. And in some ways, it's only waving sticks. The stick has never landed. But just waving it has been sufficient to get some action. So the interesting one at the bottom is also that they see it as a way of attracting funding. Now, at the moment, there's not a direct link around funding in the HR Excellence Award, but there's enough writing on the wall. And it does make the evaluation process easier if you do have the HR Excellence Award. So in some ways, it just makes life easier if you are engaged in this in terms of applying for European funds. So how are we doing? Through the surveys that we do, through Cross and Pearls, we look at institutional progress, and we publish every 2 years an update in terms of progress. This is the 2015 results. So Cross is entirely voluntary. Institutions can choose whether to engage in it, and this year, we're still 15, aren't we? 72 universities took part in it, and we had responses from almost 9,000 researchers. So that's about 29% of our research staff population. We're making some progress on fixed-term contracts. That's a tricky one. It's a tricky one in the UK. It's exceptionally tricky in Ireland, but we are making some progress there. We've seen huge progress in terms of just giving research staff who come into the institution an induction at an institutional or a faculty level. It's some basic good practice going on here that wasn't happening before. The assumption that you could employ somebody and just, throw them into a small room and tell them to get on with their research project without inducting them in terms of supporting how they work within the institution. We've seen a huge increase in terms of research staff being invited to appraisal. 30% in 2003, now we're up at 67%. We've still got some way to go in terms of the responses from principal investigators. That 80% of those will have appraisals. So we still haven't got equality of opportunity, but we are making progress, and institutions are very aware of this. And appraisal is being seen as a very powerful mechanism to talk about talent management and performance review in terms of researchers. It's an opportunity to have those conversations about career development. We ask them about whether or not they feel recognized and valued for their contributions. And all research staff do so much more than just research, even if that's all they're employed for and all that's in their job description. So we need to acknowledge their contribution in that. And through the conversations we have with researchers, this often isn't about money. This is about somebody saying thank you, or somebody saying that, you're doing a good job, or you're an excellent teacher, or, thank you for doing that public engagement. Some of this isn't about money at all. It's about recognizing their contribution to institutional success. The work-life balance statistics are really high, 69%. And if you compare that to the PIs, who are 46% of them, and they get increasingly unhappy as you look at longer experience levels in institutions. And if you look at that by gender, it starts getting worse. And the poor, more experienced females are very unhappy in terms of their work-life balance. So giving that message back to researchers that actually it's not nirvana once you step over that line and get an academic position. In fact, if you look at what the PIs are saying, that you go downhill from that point. And I think, we need to be honest in terms of some of those challenges. There's an extraordinary change in culture that researchers are not expecting when they make that transition. We see it at PhD level. They don't anticipate that change from PhD to research staff, and they don't anticipate that change to academic as well. And we need to make sure they understand that it is different and there are different priorities on them. So very, very good results in terms of being encouraged to participate in professional development, good results in terms of equality and diversity and equal opportunity and being treated fairly. So we're making good progress, but we've still got a long way to go. And this is the combined results. Institutions can see their own results. They can cross-tabulate that by discipline so that they can see what's happening in individual departments, say in the health sciences, compared to the health sciences across the rest of the UK. It's a very flexible tool. Nobody but the institution can see the institutional results. So you can very privately look to see how well you're doing against the average and against benchmark groups. So you can set up your own benchmark groups or look at, say, how do you compare with the Russell group. So as part of the work that we're doing, we looked at whether or not the things that are happening in the UK are also happening across Europe. And we reviewed in 2013 109 universities that had the HR Excellence Award at that point. And we looked to see what common actions are happening. So if you want a list of where you should start in terms of what you should review, this is your list. Because this is what institutions are looking at most commonly in terms of changing the environment for researchers. Pay and progression at the top of the list. Everybody's looking at them. Not many people are making much inroads in terms of making those changes. Recruitment processes. Are your recruitment process fair and equitable? Are you dealing with the issues of unconscious bias? Are you ensuring that your panels are trained and that you're getting the best researchers you can have? So a nice list there in terms of the things that you can do within an institution, or even as a funder, what you would require an institution to do if you're going to give them money. I'd like to just emphasize here why this is important. And this slide is adapted from one from the European Commission. We had the European Commission come and talk at our conference in September. And it was an interesting message that came across. Article 32, and people just call it Article 32. So in case you've heard that expression, this is what it's about. It's about the recruitment and working conditions of researchers. And effectively it's saying that if you have funding from the European Commission which employs researchers or doctoral candidates, you need to take all measures to implement the principles of the Chartering Code. And that includes working conditions, transparent and merit-based recruitment, and career development opportunities. There are consequences of non-compliance. This is very European language, European Commission language. At audit stage, partway through the contract, you can be audited, and there are consequences if you're not complying with Article 32. And I'm reproducing the slide that the Commission used when they were at our conference in terms of what are the consequences of non-compliance. So if you want a stick, that in terms of stick to wave, this is the message that was said publicly at our conference. In terms of, if you did not comply with Article 32, all costs can be rejected, your grant can be reduced, there can be recovery of monies not spent, there can be penalties, they can take away the contract, they can take away, I don't know who the beneficiary is, I presume that's the contract leader. The PI, yeah. Depending on the severity of the breach. Now, the presenter said, well, I don't think we should take away all the money, but I would have thought between 5 and 25% is adequate to make institutions listen. Now, I don't for a minute think that this is going to get through, but this is the direction of travel. This is where the Commission is in terms of the level of seriousness of engaging in this agenda. And increasingly, PIs, people putting in grant proposals are going to be asked to demonstrate that they are abiding by the Chartering Code. So, a little diversion here. How am I doing for time? I've got 5 minutes. Oh, I'm going to have to be very quick on this. This is my favorite project at the moment because we wanted to look at what happens to researchers if they leave, if they don't get an academic position, because there wasn't any data on this. And how do you provide careers advice if you don't know where they're going? You don't know what sort of jobs they're doing. So this was a European project. It was crowdfunded. I persuaded all of these organizations to give me a little bit of money to do it. We got 856 responses from across Europe. We had a predominantly female response. None of this is representative, so we don't know whether there's more females leaving or not because there are no statistics to check this against. We got half of the responses from the biomedical and biological sciences, and about 40% had spent 6 to 9 years as a researcher. So that's the sort of critical cohort that we're talking about anyway, that they've made a really important investment in their research career and then they've decided to move out. Now, these are not people who are not good enough, to use another term I hear all the time. You know, if you're not good enough, you have to get out. These are not people who are underachievers. These are people who are highly successful. I don't think if I did a similar profile in terms of what prizes or achievements people in the research staff population, that we get such a high response. We're losing people who've had ERC fellowships. We're losing people who have published in high-impact journal. Sorry, I shouldn't be using that word. Sorry, I've just fallen into my own trap. Sorry. People are leaving the academic community who have been highly successful researchers. And we asked them why they left. And they could agree or strongly agree with about 18 items in terms of positive and negative reasons for leaving. And I think the most shocking part of this project is this slide, really. If you look at those percentages in terms of why they're leaving, they're looking for better long-term prospects, more job security, move away from fixed-term contracts, a better work-life balance, and they couldn't secure a position, better working environment. Any one of those is bad enough, but put them all together in terms of those percentages and you can see the problem. Researchers are walking away from an environment that's unacceptable. Now, quite a lot of them are doing it reluctantly because we know they all wanted to be researchers. This is where they're going. And this is one of my messages about these people are not lost. This isn't a leaky pipeline. These people, and a quarter of them are still working in higher education, still working in universities, but in jobs other than research staff, other than academic jobs. So they're working in research offices, knowledge transfer, training and development, careers advice. They're working in public administration, and the majority of that 12%, that green 12%, and the 9 charity percent are people working in the funding, the research funding organizations. So these people are supporting the entire research system. We need them. We need highly qualified, informed employees to support the whole process of funding and ensuring research. You see them in science publication, you see them in public engagement, you see them in consultancy, and only quite a small percentage going into research and development in other sectors. But the variety of sectors they're moving into is extraordinary, and I think we should celebrate this. If you look at the occupations, it's even more diverse. Research and development managers are as anybody that's not still basically a sort of bench researcher, but they've moved up to a more management responsibility. So still a very high proportion are researching in terms of their normal occupation. But you see a whole variety of occupations there. We ask them what they do in their current jobs. Very high statistics, I think, in terms of still using the skills, competencies, and knowledge as a researcher. Now, we ask them about their career aspirations. The profile of these people who have moved out of a research staff position is exactly the same as those still in it. Around 80% wanted to be an academic when they were a researcher. And we asked them about their career aspirations now. Only 13% would go back. So although they may have left reluctantly, they have made that transition and they're very comfortable in terms of their current careers. Interestingly, we see a huge increase in terms of those that want to be self-employed. That's out of alignment a bit, isn't it? Those who want to be self-employed and those who are looking at a non-research career outside higher education. So quite a change in terms of that transition. And we ask them if they're satisfied with their current job. And again, we're getting very high statistics there in terms of levels of satisfaction. So these are some of the happy, smiling faces of the people who responded to the survey and were happy to tell their stories. We asked them what were the challenges in making that transition, what were the opportunities that they found, and what advice would they give to current research staff. So these are all published in terms of those individual career stories, and they represent disciplines and countries across Europe. So my final slide is, so what can we do? I think the first and the most important message is collectively, you all have to get together. You have to do it at all levels. You have to all face in the same direction. And then as long as you're moving forward, no matter how slowly, you should celebrate that. Because this is a long-term change. We reckon it's a generation and a half to do some of the changes that we want to do. And we've been at it for almost a generation in terms of how long we've been pushing this agenda in the UK. But we can see extraordinary progress. but it is a long and a hard journey, and we all have to collectively work at it. So the first thing in terms of top of the list for me is that, you're between two rocks and a hard place with your Fixed Term Workers Act and your tenure at universities. So you need to do something about that. And I presume it's at government level, but I think collectively the institutions and the funders and the researchers need to say this has to change. I remember being at the Trinity event that's mentioned in your briefing document. We were talking exactly the same story then in 2006, and I'm back here in 2015 saying exactly the same things. Please don't invite me back in 10 years for me to say exactly the same thing. Please invite me back to celebrate that the whole thing's transformed and we have moved on. Funders can leverage their funding. You are extraordinarily powerful. It doesn't take much. Wave a stick and hit them with carrots is our motto. So do what you can. PIs respond immediately to threats to funding. So you can use that in terms of your terms and conditions. You can make the differences. I mentioned the National Health Research. They only had to announce it. They didn't even have to implement it, and it changed behaviors. And now everybody thinks that all the research councils are going down the same route. So every department, every discipline is now mad to get the Athena Swan in case the research council suddenly announce that they're going to do it. And then they have no intention of doing it, but the risk is there. Institutions, you need to introduce talent management strategies and performance management. So far, because researchers are on fixed-term contracts and they're going to leave, there is, you know that there's going to be turnover, and therefore it's easy to say, oh, well, they're going to leave anyway, and there's new ones coming in. I think, but how do you talent spot? How do you make sure that you are supporting, identifying and supporting the very best to ensure those that ideally you want to see in your institution and not leaving the system? How do you support those that do not have the opportunity or the capability to make an academic career? How do you support them in a positive way? Some of the messages we're getting out of this What Do Research Staff Do Next project are really sad in terms of the emotional trauma of going through that process, not least the way their own colleagues treat them once they make that decision to leave. And researchers, you have an obligation as well. You need to have a collective voice, and it needs to be a positive and constructive voice. It's about how do we collectively move forward. This isn't going to be solved overnight. We're certainly never going to get beyond that, around 10% of people being able to progress through an academic career. We can make that progress much easier and more structured. But those 80% are not all going to get academic careers, and we need to acknowledge that, and how do we support them? And then finally, every researcher needs to take personal responsibility for their own actions and their own careers. Being an excellent researcher is not enough. It's not going to happen. You have to be so much more than that. You have to think about all of those policy initiatives and the changing environment I talked about. You need to make sure your networks are as strong as they are. You need to make sure your competencies are as strong as they are. And you need to benchmark yourself against other people so that you can make sensible decisions about your careers. And then finally, you need to keep an open mind to all opportunities in terms of potential research, because there's an extraordinary number of jobs that are highly satisfying for researchers. And I do suggest that you have a look at some of those career stories so that you can be inspired about the opportunities available for you. So, thank you.
We have time perhaps for a couple of questions, if anybody wants to raise one now. Yes, please. Just introduce yourself.
I'm Maria Ivancheva from Social Justice at University College Dublin. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask if these slides would be available first for people at the conference. And then the second question is already content related. So I'm wondering, there are two messages that you just gave us even in your conclusions. One is scrap the control framework, like employment control frameworks, and introduce more permanent position. Second is it's great to get more people out of academia. There is a lot of double standard there across the universities that on the one hand hire staff and do a lot to show us the exit point, and that kind of seems to reduce the possibility for collective action and mobilization for any meaningful change. A lot of people are shown, the brand new world out there that is full of employment opportunities, but it's true that in most sectors, opportunities are as scarce as in academia, and fixed-term contracts are increasing. So I think we should think of which is the better option and choose one, rather than say both are there and they're available, because it just seems we're going through the door, and that's what's happening.
So that's quite a sort of complex comment in terms of answering that. So can I say, first of all, I didn't suggest that we have more permanent contracts. In fact, I don't support tenure. I think what you should do is get rid of tenure. I said it 10 years ago. The UK got rid of tenure in 1989. And our research system hasn't fallen apart. We're still doing pretty well on that. So that's, for me, that would be top of my list. Get rid of tenure, so you're opening up the system and there's more flow and mobility and movement within the academic community. And the other is, I don't think it's an either or. I think the one thing that's coming out of this research stuff is that it's a continuum of opportunities. Some very focused around research, through to some that involve research, some doesn't, different sectors, other opportunities, so those that are moving away from research altogether. And it is a competitive job market. We cannot see the doctoral qualification as being purely a training for academia. It has to be seen as a generic qualification. And I think part of this issue is that we're not getting that message across at all to our young researchers. We need to look more broadly at that. We need to encourage researchers to experience and to recognize the wide range of opportunities. It's not a pathway to academia anymore. And I think that's one of the challenges.
I can see lots of hands going up, but equally I can see the hands on my clock rotating. We will have obviously a panel discussion. There is a chance for greater input from the tables later in the morning. So I think at this point I'll thank Janet very much for her stimulating contribution, and indeed for her Herculean effort in getting here.
I've got to get back.
Okay, and thanks very much, Janet.